Hi, Anna.
Hi, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Doing good, doing good. Trying to stay warm.
I know it's chilly.
It is absolutely freezing.
Yeah. Now, where are you from originally?
I'm from North Carolina,
Okay.
small town, small rural town in North Carolina called Mint Hill. So
Okay.
it's a lot warmer there.
Are the winters not bad?
No, I've only seen snow a few times in my life, so
Oh,
and it's only
really?
been a few inches. So I'm excited for the winter here.
Yeah. So this will
Yeah,
be your first winter
yeah,
here?
first snowy winter. So
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Cool. Well, welcome to Boise. When did you come to Boise?
A few months ago, I moved up here with my husband in June. So the day after our wedding, we moved up here.
Great.
So yeah,
Well, welcome.
thank you.
Yeah. Fortunately, the winters do not get too bad here. I'm originally from upstate New York, where we would get 180, 200 inches of snow a winter. So I don't mind what we get here. This is
Oh
mild.
yeah, this probably seems mild to you then.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. Well, we've got a few people coming. Still, I'm expecting
I've arrived.
Mike Wetherill is arrived
Hi, Mike.
by phone.
Hello there.
Good morning. Well, afternoon, I guess. I don't know what time or day it is. So
It still feels like morning.
I was like up early and got some stuff done. And I was like, maybe I should do this more often. And then I'll probably wake up tomorrow and just be like, nah.
Yeah,
So
I know. I know. That's always the way. Like, hey, I can do this. And then you
it's
go.
just easier to get stuff done when people aren't like, hey, can you read this? Hey, can you do that?
I
So
know. Well, I have finally gotten myself to be waking up at 5:20 a.m. to get
ugh.
stuff done, and then with the time change, I'm thinking I might actually be able to start getting up at 5. So we'll see how that goes.
Well, Godspeed, sir.
Yeah, I know.
I'm not a morning person.
I
Or at
know.
least I
Me
didn't used
neither.
to be. I'm like slowly inching that way as I'm finally feel like
Yeah,
I'm finally starting to turn the tide of being an old lady.
yeah, it's a sign of age. My dad gets up at like 4 o'clock every day.
My grandma used to do that all the time, and she would just read, you know,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
it's like well, better than just staring at the ceiling, trying to be
yeah.
quiet for everybody else.
Yeah, no, I'm spending the first, I don't know, 20 years of my career on the night shift.
Yeah,
I don't think I'll ever get used to getting up in the morning.
yeah. Hi, Dana.
Hey, Dana.
Hi.
Also, I may have to sneak some curly fries while this goes down, so I'm sorry for snacking.
Well,
Totally in favor of curly
put
fries.
yourself on mute. All right. I think Sophie said she couldn't join us this week, and I don't know about Jim. Jim's in today, right? But
You should be, but I don't know if I've seen him yet.
okay. Well, it's 101, so why don't we go ahead and get started, and then if Jim joins us, he will.
Here, I'll slack him real quick and just remind him.
Okay. All right. So Anna Miller, welcome and thanks for joining us. Today, like I said, want to just have kind of a casual conversation and have you give us some information about student-centered funding models. It's something that has come up and in our candidate interviews, and we realized we kind of don't know a lot about it, and I saw that you were tweeting about it, and figured you'd be a good person to ask about it. So maybe if you want to start out and just give us a good backgrounder on what we're talking about when we're talking about student-centered funding when it comes to public education.
Sure, yeah, and thanks.
Could we intro ourselves?
Oh,
just so
yeah,
she knows
I'm
who she's
sorry. Why
talking
don't we
to?
do that? Why don't we do some intro?
Didn't mean to interrupt, Anna.
I assume everybody knows everybody. So I'm Scott McIntosh. I'm the opinion page editor of The Statesman. I've been with The Statesman for about a year now. I've been in Idaho and the Treasure Valley since 2006. I used to own the CUNA Melbourne News newspaper, and then I was the editor very briefly of the paper in Ontario, Oregon, and then the editor of the Idaho Press Tribune. Christina?
I'm Christina Lords. I'm the editor of the Idaho Statesman. I've also worked for other Idaho media outlets in Moscow, Idaho Falls, and also in Nampa at the Press Tribune. Fifth generation Idahoan, really love being here and reporting on Idaho's issue.
And Mike?
My name is Mike Wetherell. My family's been in Idaho since 1909. I spent 10 years on the staff of Senator Frank Church in Washington and in Idaho. And I served 17 years on the Boise City Council and 12 years as a district court judge. And back in the early 1990s, I was chairman of the Idaho State Democratic Party.
Dana?
Hi, I'm Dana Oland. I'm a former reporter for the Statesman. I covered arts and culture since 2000. I have been in Idaho since 1996, and now I do social media engagement for the Idaho Statesman and 4 other McClatchy newspapers.
And Jim?
Yes, hi, Anna. My name is Jim Kieser. I'm the breaking news editor at the Statesman. I've been with the Statesman since 2012, March 2012. Been on the editorial board since January, and I've had a variety of positions editing positions at the Statesman. This is the latest incarnation. Thanks for joining us.
And Anna, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself as an introduction?
Absolutely. It's lovely to meet all of you. The more Idahoans that I meet, the more that I love them and love this state. So my name's Anna Miller. I'm from originally North Carolina, a small rural town in North Carolina called Mint Hill. I lived there most of my life until I went to college in South Carolina at Furman University. Then I worked in Washington, D.C. for a number of years and went to graduate school there. And then I recently, this year, moved to Boise with my husband. And we love it here. We're really enjoying our time. And then I started a few months ago a job with Idaho Freedom Foundation as the education policy analyst. And that is what has brought me to Boise.
And that is what has brought you to us.
Yes.
So, all right. So give us a little bit of a backgrounder on what student-centered funding in public education is all about.
Sure. So when we talk about student-centered funding, we're really talking about any school choice program that allows money to follow the child. A great example of one of these programs is education savings accounts. Those exist in a number of states. One very successful education savings accounts program is in Arizona. So Arizona, their account allocates about 90% of state per pupil funding to eligible students to apply. Eligibility for education savings accounts there is based on income brackets. It prioritizes working class, lower class families and special needs students. And so not everyone in a public school applies for those funds, but students that need outside resources, want to attend a private school or want to go to a charter school or use alternative learning options, they can take those funds to those places to get the services that they need. So that in a nutshell is what we're talking about when we're talking about money following the child and student-centered funding.
Okay, and so then how does it work logistically? So you talk a little bit about those details. So 90% of the funding, how exactly does that work?
Yeah, so 90% of their per pupil funding for that state is allocated to a government authorized debit card that the government controls and monitors. And it's given to a family to be able to use for whatever outside education services they want. And it expires within 4 years of students graduating high school. So families really diversify, at least on the studies that have been done on education savings accounts. It shows that families diversify in their spending of these education dollars. Some families choose to do low-cost education options outside of the public school system and use the funding to save for college. Some of them use the funding for extra tutoring services. Some of them attend private schools. So there's a number of different ways that families can utilize those funds.
Okay.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Yeah.
On the debit card, about how much is that, just ballpark figure, when they get the card?
Well, it depends
Generally speaking, I guess.
Yeah, it depends on the per pupil funding in a state. So, if you're going to do say a state does 90%, some states do less, smaller percentages than that of their per pupil funding. So it could be $5,000, it could be $6,000. In Idaho, if you go off of the common figure that's cited for per pupil funding here, which is around a little over $6,000, I believe 6,800, then maybe it would be about $5,000 or $5,500 that are allocated to a student, which still leaves that public school with the additional, say, 10% of funding or whatever it is outside of the percentage that the state chooses to allocate. It leaves that money behind in the school, and then obviously they wouldn't be educating that student, so they don't need the funding that would belong to that student.
Okay, and so students who choose to stay in their home school, their home district public school, that money would just go, that entire money would stay with that high school or middle school or whatever school they're at.
Yes, so a student actually has to apply for an education savings account, and typically there are tiers of who is eligible to apply. So like I mentioned before, sometimes it's prioritized for special needs students or students that are bullied in a school, or students whose parents are lower in the income bracket. And those are the students that are eligible to apply. Obviously, not every single one of those students is going to say the public school isn't suiting their needs. I think there's plenty of students that like their public school and want to stay in it. An education savings account doesn't force anyone to leave, doesn't force anyone to accept funds. It's purely choices made by families individually based on what they think their child needs.
Okay, and so all right, a couple things. One is that won't necessarily cover the entire cost of, say, a private school. And I know in Idaho that certainly wouldn't, $5,000. So would the family still be required to pay above and beyond, or would a private school still be allowed to charge above and beyond that, what's in that savings account?
Well, obviously some families aren't going to want to pay extra outside of the funding that is allocated to them for a school. But I believe the cheapest private school in Idaho is actually around $2,000, which is obviously significantly less. Now, there's obviously a lot of counties, and private schools are more expensive in certain counties than others. So not every family is going to even want to use their funds for a private school. Some might be able to use that money to afford a private school. But again, there's a lot of alternative learning options, whether it's hiring a private tutor, going to a learning pod, or using those funds for homeschooling. There's a lot of different options and ways that parents can use this money to serve their child's needs.
Okay, and so then the next question I have is a little bit more philosophical. The money, the per pupil funding that we provide is it doesn't really belong to the students. It's everybody in the state, whether they have a child or not, or they have a student in a school or not, contributes to that funding. And it doesn't really belong to that individual student. You see what I'm getting at?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a very common point. I'm really glad that you brought that up. Schools do exist solely for the education of children. Tax dollars exist to serve people's needs. They are for the people. And yes, there is a certain amount of everyone opting into a certain society agrees to pay taxes. We're not talking about giving every single family this per pupil spending. We're talking about freeing tax dollars so that they can follow students to schools that best fit their needs. If a certain public school isn't fitting a student's needs, why should they be forced to stay there? For example, what if a student is being bullied in their school? That's not fair to them. And even if the students that bullied them are expelled, they may never feel safe in that school again. Mm-hmm. They shouldn't be forced to stay in that school just because people are arguing over who should get the money to educate this child.
Right. So then getting back a little bit to the logistics of it, I mean, if we were to do this, and I don't know and I don't know what numbers are coming out of Arizona, but this would necessarily take money out of the public education system. That if you had, 10,000 students apply for this money and they would, get $5,000 each, they would be necessarily taking that money that ordinarily would be going into the public education system, and it would reduce the amount of money that public schools get in Idaho, correct?
Well, that's an interesting point, but what I would like to point out there is that schools are given money in Idaho and in most states based on the number of students that attend there. That's why we call it per pupil funding. And when a student leaves, that school doesn't need the money used to educate that child. And with an education savings account, when that student leaves, they leave a certain amount of funding behind in that school. For example, it could be 10%, could be 30%. Education account could be only 50% of the per pupil funding. So they actually arguably have more funds than they otherwise would, because they no longer have to internalize the cost of educating that student. Another thing would be that increased funding, at least in Idaho, hasn't really been proven to increase or improve learning outcomes. So for the last decade or so, we've funneled about $600 million into our public schools, and test scores, at least according to the nation's report card, are stagnant or have decreased. So before all of that funding was funneled into our schools, test scores for students for 4th and 8th grade at least were improving more between 1990 and 2011 and 2013 than they are now.
Right, and I think the counter argument to that is that we suffered such great cuts in the education budget at the recession, the Great Recession, and we're just now kind of climbing back to barely even pre-recession levels. I think that
well, funding for K through 12 schools has been increasing for decades and decades and decades, every single year. Education outcomes have not improved. You won't find any data for that.
Go ahead, Dana.
I just have a couple quick questions. First off, back in the 90s, we certainly had a lot fewer students in schools. So I think a teacher to student ratio may have had a little something to do with that. But my question is, when a student gets this money, is it intended for them to leave the school? Because you had said earlier, they don't necessarily have to leave the school. So if they're still in school and they're using this extra money to pay for tutors or a special education program or something outside of the classroom, how does that affect the balance of the money that's being spent in that school?
Okay, so first I would like to make a point in regards to the teacher-student ratio. Class sizes definitely have an effect on student learning outcomes. I don't think that's contested anywhere. Public schools have a lot of children to take care of, and that's why there are some students who don't get their needs met. That doesn't mean that teachers at public schools aren't working as hard as they can. It doesn't mean that they're not great educators. I think so many of them are really fantastic educators. It just means that they have a lot of students to take care of, and there's other schools that are able to prioritize those students in different ways. So then to the point of, is this money intended to make students leave a public school? No, it's not. Those students could take that funding to go to a different public school if they wanted, and the money would follow them and make sure that that student is fully funded at that school and that that school has the funds that they need. So you don't have to go to a private school. You don't have to use alternative learning methods. You could just go to a different public school. Right now, the government discriminates against students. Sorry, phone. Right now, the government discriminates against students based on their zip code. So just because you live in a certain area, you can't have access to any public school that you want. You have to attend the one near you. What if there's a great public school just in a district 10, 15 minutes away that a student wants to attend? They can't. The government says they can't. They have to stay in one place because of their zip code. And I personally experienced this in my life. So I have 7 siblings. Each of us graduated from different middle schools, different high schools. I've personally experienced homeschooling, alternative learning methods, private school, and public school. When I began attending a public school, it was probably one of the better public schools in my area. It fit my main needs, which at the time, my main need was athletics. And I had an older sibling that went there. I was rezoned based on my zip code to a different school that was very poor in performance, had terrible athletic programs, And the parents of my school went to the school board and begged them, absolutely begged them to allow their children to stay at their school, or at least to grandfather in siblings. And the school board absolutely refused. There was no option. So I was forced to attend a low-performing school. That school never improved. To this day, it has not improved. It's Independence High School in Mint Hill, North Carolina. And so I have great parents, and they tried to always give me the best education possible, as most parents do. And so they paid for me to go to a lower cost private school. But because of that, they could not pay for so many of my other siblings to have a private education. And so my other siblings were forced to attend that one poorly performing public school, which never improved, solely because of where we lived.
I thought Idaho had gotten rid of that Idaho now allows, and actually, encourages.
I was going to say that. At least I don't know about elementary school and junior high, but I know, and I think this was a school board decision in Pocatello, the Pocatello-Chubbuck. I'm from Pocatello. So the Pocatello-Chubbuck board, at least for your high schools, you could select. It wasn't so geographically mandated, I guess. I don't know the right word for that. But so I wonder if there's more wiggle room in state policy that way rather than altering the funding mechanisms of how we do public schools. Is that an option that you guys see as viable?
Well, absolutely. Well, first of all, if you have a particular statute you'd like to point me to where Idaho schools don't discriminate based on zip code, I would love to see that because I've never seen it. But absolutely am in favor of schools not discriminating based on zip code. That's something that should have gone away a long time ago. It discriminates against students. And as you guys probably know, there's a lot of housing and zoning laws that hurt African Americans for a very long time. Because of that, those impoverished communities are still stuck in underperforming schools because they are zoned based on their zip code. So that's something that should, no question, we need to revisit and probably change. But that still doesn't change the fact that there might be students where public school just isn't the right fit for them. Maybe they need a smaller model. Maybe they are just a better homeschooled student. Maybe they're just have a certain program, a music program or a sports program or something they need from another school. And working class families probably do not have the funds, most often do not have the funds to give their kids those additional options. So with an education savings account, it allows those students' education needs to be met in a way that just allowing students to attend any public school they want still wouldn't, although that is an important policy change to consider.
And Scott, can I ask one more follow-up question?
Absolutely, yeah. Just jump in.
We've talked about Arizona as an example. Are there other states, or how many other states have policy on the books that relate to this issue?
I believe there's 8 states right now. I can't remember all of them, but I do know Florida is one other.
Yeah.
And I believe Georgia has one too.
Okay.
But I could send you a list of states if you wanted after
All
this
right.
call that have them all. I'll make a note of that for myself.
Cool. Yeah, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, we would probably be on board with some more flexibility and, greater options and greater choice. I think our biggest, and I think even, when we were talking to Senator Lori Den Hartog, she was talking about savings accounts, and a couple other candidates were talking about savings accounts. And like the 529 plan, they recently changed the rules to that to allow and that's a tax advantaged account. It's still my money, but it's pre-tax. So I derive a tax benefit from putting it in my 529 account. And they just recently changed the law to allow that to be used for private K-12 education, which I think is, personally, I think it's great because I send my kids to private school. But I think that the squeamish part that I think we all have on the board is the use of taxpayer dollars on private businesses, so a private school. And again, I want to get back to, and I understand the philosophical argument in favor of it. And if somebody wants to go to a private school, they should, and there are certain barriers to that. But the end result, like I was getting at, if we have 10,000 students in Idaho who choose to do this, and that $5,000 per student, I mean, logistically, practically, in real terms, that is money that is going to leave the public education system. And so now, we've got district superintendents who say they don't have enough money to hire enough teachers or to pay teachers more, that they would love to have more counselors. They have to provide their own supplies and have enough money for supplies. And then we're talking about actually reducing the amount of money that would end up in the public school system that would be, quote unquote, diverted to private businesses. So how do you address that squeamishness that we have about that idea?
Yeah, I understand. So on the private businesses idea, here's the issue. The Idaho Constitution guarantees a free and thorough education for all students. There is a lot of evidence that public schools right now are not giving students a thorough education. I don't know why you have your kids in private school, but maybe that's why. So every student deserves the most thorough education we can possibly give them. We allow food stamps to be taken to grocery stores. If an Idahoan goes to shops at Albertsons with their food stamps, but Albertsons no longer offers a product they want, they can take their food stamps to Winco, to Trader Joe's, or a number of other grocery stores. But when a student is not having their needs met in a school system, we insist that those dollars have to stay behind at that school. If a student leaves a school, that school no longer needs their money that exists solely to educate them. So again, schools exist only to educate students, and that is why we fund the education system. Therefore, tax dollars truly do belong to students.
Right.
Well,
Go ahead, Mike.
I'd like to point out one thing in your quote. You talk about a free and thorough education. The word public is also in the state constitution, a free, thorough, and public education.
I believe it actually says common schools. I believe it's referring to common schools, actually, is what the exact legislation says, Article 9, Section 1.
I'm reading it.
Public free common schools. It's all in there.
Yeah, and it's general, uniform, and thorough system of public free common schools.
Public. It's an interesting reason that it's in there. I wonder if it's ever been tested in court.
Yes, but public doesn't have to mean a particular school. It can mean public money. So there's nothing in the Constitution that prevents public money from following a child. There's just the requirement that we provide students with the availability of a public education.
Well, that's why
or that
I've
the
asked
public
the question,
allows.
Has it ever been tested in court to get that definition? Do you know?
In every other state. And, for example, a recent Supreme Court case, Espinoza versus Montana, said that you cannot discriminate against private religious universities schools from receiving tax dollars. So it was in Montana, and they have a savings account program of sorts, and students there are required by the Constitution to be allowed to take their dollars to those schools.
We're not operating in Montana. We're operating in Idaho.
Well, you asked if there was ever a precedent, so I'm telling you what the precedent is.
In Idaho, I asked if in Idaho.
Well, we haven't had that discussion yet here. That's why we're bringing it up, because it's really important for Idahoans to talk about.
Yeah, I'm just pointing out that when you give a specific statement, you ought to include it all, or you're going to get in trouble.
Okay. So I want to. Did you ask me, Jim?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Scott. And it is our back. This jumps back to performance. You were talking about performance earlier. I can't do. Does data exist on how private and charter school children perform in Idaho?
Yeah. So the State Department.
Yeah.
The State Department of Education does collect testing scores for charter schools versus public schools in Idaho, and charter schools overwhelmingly, and I've been tracking this data, I'm planning to produce some research on it, charter schools overwhelmingly outperform public school students. Now, there's obviously a number of reasons for that. Charter schools are smaller. Charter school acceptance, of course, might be more public than even a public school because they accept everyone they can, and it's based on a lottery system, so they don't discriminate based on zip code. And so there is a lot of data suggesting that charter schools outperform public schools, but I do have some issue with that data in certain states because there can be different socioeconomic factors at different schools, right? So I don't think the fact that charter schools are outperforming public schools means that every charter school is better than every public school. I don't think that it does. I do think they have more autonomy over the decision making, which allows them, and smaller student bases, which allows them to meet their students' needs fairly often, and that's why there's such a long waiting list for those schools. One other point I'll make about charter schools, though, is that recently a really large study was done by economist Thomas Sowell on charter schools in New York, and he looked at charter schools that operated in the same building. And he found that minorities in those charter schools were outperforming all other students in public schools that were just operating on one floor below. So I think that's probably one of the best studies to look at to compare charter school performance versus public school. Now, again, it doesn't hold in every case, and I'm not saying that it does, but it's an important factor to consider.
Well, I want to be clear, though, too, because charter schools are public schools, too.
Yes, they're just not traditional public schools. So I should have clarified that, of course. They're almost more public, again. They're almost more public than a traditional public school because they do try to accept everyone, and acceptance is based on a lottery, not zip code.
Yeah.
But thanks. Yeah, that's what I was getting at, and I was quickly Googling. I was trying to find, some information myself, so that.
Yeah, just go to the State Department website. So they have it all there.
Yeah.
So, yeah, the reason that I took my kids out of public school was because of the cuts in education funding from the recession. And my kids were in elementary school at the time, and the class sizes were about to go up to 35, 36 students per class. And I definitely had other reasons. But that was one of the main ones, is that I didn't think that 35 or 36 students per class was going to be a tenable situation. And fortunately, we were in a position that we were able to send our kids to private school. And I always looked at it, for sure, did not like the idea that I'm still paying taxes for schools, but I always felt like, well, my taxes are not paying for my kids' education. My taxes are paying for everybody's kids' education, and that's kind of the way I felt about it. I think that if my taxes were sending a kid to a private school, though, I'd be squeamish about that, and I don't know how I can get around that squeamishness about sending tax dollars to private businesses.
So are you saying that even though your kids are lucky enough to have a private education, that you don't think other students should be given that opportunity just because they're not wealthy enough?
Yeah, I mean, it's like the free market system. I work my ass off so that I can make enough money to send my kids to private school, and so I should reap the benefits of working hard and increasing my station in life and having personal responsibility to send my kids to private school.
Well, absolutely, you should. Absolutely, you should. But every student deserves to go to a school that suits their needs. Again, we let the food stamps example. We already let Idahoans take tax dollars to private institutions. But all of a sudden, when it comes to school, everyone has a problem with it.
Well, as somebody who have no kids, and pay taxes to educate my community, which I'm proud and happy to do, wouldn't it, if we had a state public grocery store where people could spend their food stamps, maybe that's the answer of, a state-funded, state-run public grocery store. And it sounds like is what you're suggesting.
No, I'm not suggesting that at all. Okay. Limiting choices to only one public grocery store would hamper lots of people from getting the benefits they want. What if they want to go to Whole Foods and get great organic food, and the public grocery store doesn't offer that? And that is absolutely not what I'm advocating for.
Okay. I guess that's how I was taking your comment about public versus private school.
Well,
So
no, she's taking the exact opposite, that we don't expect a single public grocery store to provide those needs.
well,
And
no, we don't. But it's also that, which is why, I don't know. Anyway,
yeah, and I think
pass.
I think that is a little bit of the philosophical difference, is that education is also compulsory for kids, that we require education. We don't require everyone to go on food stamps. We require every kid to go to school. And as a society, we have taken on that, good or bad, we have taken on that mandate to educate every kid through a system of public free common schools. And I asked one of the candidates this question, because this is also something I have trouble understanding. Should we be spending less on education? And also, is this some sort of argument against public education altogether? If public schools aren't working, increasing funding for public schools doesn't work, is this an argument that we should just get rid of public schools altogether?
Yeah, that's a really important question. I think, again, there's a lot of students that would want to stay in their public schools for whatever reason. I would have stayed in the original public school I would have zoned for as a child if I could have, because it fit my two main needs, family and athletics. An education savings account, which is what most school choice advocates are arguing for, it does not force anyone to leave. It only gives students the option to use the funds that exist to educate them at another institution. Again, those funds don't belong to the public school. They exist to educate students. The compulsory education laws require every student to be educated. It doesn't require every student to attend a public school.
Right. And
Can I ask one more follow-up question?
Yeah.
Do you have an estimate on how many folks would actually apply for something like this in Idaho or in the other states where this is available? Do you have, ballpark figures on how many people take advantage of that?
That's hard to say. There's no way for me to know every independent student's calculation and needs. For example, in Arizona, I know that about 30% of their students take those funds. I believe it's about 30%. I can double check on that and give you guys the exact figure.
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out, is it like everybody or 5% or just general feel?
I will say, with the Governor Little's recent safe students, safe schools, or his recent grants that he gave out to students, that it was going to affect 10% of students that would be eligible. That's almost already filled, and the funding is already out. So that shows right there that at least 10% of families in Idaho really need those funds and would use them. Again, you can tailor an education savings account to be as broad or as narrow as you want it to be. For me, I would say you should prioritize working class families. And again, not all of those families are going to want to leave the public school, and some of them might just want to go to a different public school.
And so my family used to live in the CUNA school district, and when I was there and sending my kids to public schools there, the school district created Initial Point Alternative High School. And this is exactly what you're talking about. This was kids who had been outright expelled from CUNA High, or they were acting up, or they had been arrested, or whatever. They were having trouble getting bullied at the high school, and the CUNA school district created this school, a separate school for kids who did not fit in the traditional high school model. Why not just create more of these types of schools within the public school system, rather than use tax dollars to fund private schools?
Well, one thing is that we need tax dollars to follow students so that we can start more schools. I would definitely be in favor of having more charter schools. Those schools operate with more autonomy, like I said previously, test scores usually are higher because they have fewer students to serve, and smaller class sizes do really help students. There are systems like in New Orleans, Louisiana, that have almost entirely charter school systems, and test scores since they started that system have skyrocketed. But in order to even start a system like that, you would need tax dollars to follow the child to fund those schools.
Yeah, and so I guess that's where I was going with this. Isn't it possible, because that's what happened with Initial Point, is that those kids started going to that school, and voila, Initial Point had a budget because they had this average daily attendance. And I probably think we would probably most agree here that we got to get rid of this average daily attendance formula. And I know that the legislature is working on that. And so I guess this is what piqued my interest when we were talking to Senator Den Hartog about this as well, is that can you apply this student-centered funding formula to just the public education system and not have it be like a voucher system for private schools?
Well, yes, the answer is that you could. And like I said, I'm certainly in favor of expanding charter schools, and I think money should have followed the child at least within the public school system a long time ago. If there was to be a bill that did that, I would support it. Do I think it's perfect? No, but I'm not going to let good get in the way of, or let great get in the way of good. I still think that there could be charter schools and public schools. If those are the only schools students are allowed to take their money to, it's still limiting their options. And more choice for students is always better, because they deserve to go, again, wherever their needs are met. And if that's a private school, they deserve to go there.
Other questions from the board?
In terms of statistical following of these programs, I think we all speak from standpoint of our own personal experiences. I had 3 daughters. I still have 3 daughters. One of them graduated from public schools, and 2 of them attended private schools because that was what they wanted to do, and so I footed the bill. I never anticipated anybody was going to pay me back for it, except maybe my daughters in my old age. And so the interesting thing was, the only daughter that graduated cum laude from the university was the one that went to public school, even though the other 2 were very good students. So she got an excellent education at Boise High School, which is the oldest public high school in the city. It's the thing that I find so difficult to deal with on these things is the fact that there are limited dollars available, and there are crowded classrooms in the public schools. And as long as there are crowded classrooms in the public schools and they are not being adequately funded, why are we pushing for public funding for a different education system? If someone wants to send their kids to private school, that's fine. I'm all in favor of that. But I assumed I had to pay for it when I made that decision. And I would assume that other people have to make that assumption when they make that decision.
Well, that's a really good point, Mike. And you're right that when people send their kids to private schools, they internalize those costs and they accept that they have to pay for it. Right now, because of compulsory education laws and the way that schools are set up, working class families, lower middle class, and mostly minority families have no choice but to attend their local public school, and they have no other options. Allowing money to follow them to other institutions is in line with how we treat other taxpayer dollars. Again, schools do exist to educate children, and for no other reason those tax dollars do not exist to prop up an institution. They do not exist to protect jobs. They exist to educate students, and that's how we should prioritize them. Another issue, this idea of the public school system being underfunded. Again, we've funneled over $600 million into our public schools over the last decade, and learning outcomes have not improved. And again, that's largely because we're expecting a public school system to be everything for everyone. There's a ton of students there. Those teachers are overworked, they're exhausted, and they can't possibly be everything for everyone. We should allow schools to specialize in different services and stop propping up institutions, which isn't really helping anyone. It's just protecting a system.
Okay. Are there any other questions?
I have one more. I'm so sorry. I keep coming back to the other states because I'm always interested in how things are going elsewhere. So it seems like we've kind of been circling on this idea of if we take this public funding and infuse it into other options, that perhaps the public schools themselves will be worse off in general. Have we seen that also continue in some of these other states, or have you researched that aspect of it? In Arizona, how are the public schools doing and their funding and things like that? I know that's a very general, big question, but just wondering if you've had any observations on that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And again, public schools are, with an education savings account, arguably have more funds than they otherwise would, because 10% at least of that funding remains behind in that school, but they don't have to educate that student any longer. And again, the public schools overall are not underfunded. We funded $600 million into that system. And then there was another part to your question. Can you repeat the last part for me? I just lost my train of thought.
I'm just trying to get at it. If the main concern that people have with this idea is if we're shifting public tax dollars out of our public school system, where does that leave the public school system in the states that have implemented some of these policies? Are they continuing to see decline in productivity and outcomes and percentages and things like that for students, or has it stayed the same? Has it gotten better? That there's less students in these public schools or have shifted around? Just trying to get that at the 10,000 foot level. How are those public schools operating now after these policies have been put in place?
Well, overall, this is what I can say. Students that participate in school choice programs usually are more likely to get accepted into college, and they're more likely to have higher test scores. The students that remain in public schools also benefit because the public school is given feedback that they're not providing the right services for everyone, and they're given the opportunity to innovate, they're given the opportunity to improve. I'm not aware of a particular study that has looked at what are the exact effects on a public school. Is this, what have they specifically improved since students left? But again, it's not leaving them with less funding. They have more funding than they otherwise would because dollars are still left behind and they no longer have to educate that student.
Because here's the other.
And so in Idaho, sorry, Scott. In Idaho, what do you see that percentage, like an ideal percentage for Idaho between that kind of 10% and whatever other schools or other states have done?
Yeah, I think you would have to calculate what's a realistic education cost for the state. It'd probably be a lot lower than other states. Students might not need 90% of funds. I don't know what that number is. That's a question for a lawmaker, and I mean it's something I'm looking into, but yeah, I can't give you an exact number.
Because here's the other concern, and again, this gets down to the logistics. Because I've seen this play out, and I saw this play out with the public education cuts from the Great Recession. You've got a school of 600 kids, an elementary school of 600 kids, and 10 of them, or let's even say 60 of them decide that they want to take advantage of this, and they want to go to private schools, or they go to these other various schools, and they take 90% or 60% or 50% of their funding with them. The problem is that 600 student school is going to still have to hire a certain number of teachers. They're not going to be able to reduce their teaching cadre by 10%. You know what I mean? So you'll have one class that has 26 kids instead of 27 students. You'll have another class that has 25 instead of 28, but you're still going to need a full-time employee to teach that, and so this removal of the students is going to kind of skim off the top of the money, but the requirement for funding is not going to go away. Does that make sense?
Well, again, funds do stay behind in the school, a certain percentage of them, so they have more money. If you're saying that student-teacher ratio wouldn't change when students leave, I'm not following that. If a strong number of students left, then of course there would be less teachers at that school and they might need to go to a different school. And that would be a matter of, career evaluations and rewarding really good teachers and an accountability system. But if you're saying that just 3 or 4 students leaving a particular classroom is going to cut into that teacher's salary, I don't think that's realistic.
No. In other words, you may reduce the revenues coming into that school by 10%, but you are not going to be able to realize a commensurate reduction in your expenses, because you're still going to have to hire 32 teachers. You're not going to be able to hire all of a sudden 27 teachers if you reduce the school. And again, this might be getting into the weeds a little bit, but again, I'm just thinking about the logistics when this filters down to the individual schools and you're reducing revenue and not a commensurate reduction in expenses. That's where the cuts come in. That's where you start having class sizes of 35, 36, because you don't have the commensurate revenues to cover the cost.
Okay, I see what you're saying now. And I think that comes back to the idea of fixed costs. And public schools have fixed costs. And actually every single organization, every single institution in the history of the world has fixed costs. And they adjust those fixed costs accordingly, whether they have 10% losses in a year, 20% losses in a year. They find ways to cut things. There's always things that you can reduce your spending on. And oftentimes that forces companies, and it would force any institution to innovate, improve, and spend the resources far more wisely than they otherwise would.
Okay. All right. Any other questions?
This is sort of a observation. I keep hearing this argument that money doesn't improve education. And I grew up in Mountain Home, Idaho, which is about 39 miles from here, where there's an Air Force base. And when I started going to elementary school, I went to a school that was about 100 years old and wasn't in the world's best shape. And then there was this President Dwight D. Eisenhower, because of the fact that there was an Air Force base in Mountain Home, that passed through the Congress the National Defense Education Act. And then all of a sudden, Mountain Home, because of the federal impact of the Air Force base and the additional students we received from the Air Force base, started getting new elementary schools that were constructed and a new high school that was constructed. And there were better labs for the sciences. And there were better facilities for things like shop. It wasn't just an intellectual improvement, it was an improvement throughout the school system. And that made a dramatic difference in the education system in Mountain Home. I received an excellent education because of that. Money does make a difference, and anybody that says it doesn't make a difference is not, in my opinion, being realistic. Money makes a difference.
Well, one point on that is certainly you do need money to start a school, which is why it's important for funding to follow students. But homeschoolers receive almost an essentially free education every single year. They outperform students on standardized tests, and they get accepted into excellent colleges.
My daughter has
that's free of
7
cost.
children
That's
that
free of
she
cost. So,
homeschools.
okay, so then you would know that that was likely free of cost, and that you didn't need a lot of money to give your child a great education in that regard. Also, those education.
I'm not sure what the cost is, because you're talking about the fact that she's home all the time rather than working and making money. So there's a cost involved there.
What I'm specifically talking about is, of course, there's a cost to everything, but homeschooling is incredibly low cost, and you're saying that you need more money to give students a better education. Well, there's tons and tons of free homeschool resources provided by nonprofits online, which makes homeschooling incredibly low cost. You don't need to spend lots of money to give your child a great education. But of course, not every parent can afford to homeschool their child, in the sense that they can't take off work. They have a 2-parent working household, or of course, some parents can't afford to hire a private tutor. So if that's how they choose to deliver the instruction.
No, I'm not saying that it's a magic potion, but I'm just saying it makes a difference. I've seen it make a difference, and all the statistical studies in the world are not going to convince me it doesn't.
Okay, that's fine. You don't have to listen to statistical studies. That's totally up to you. I understand.
Okay. All right.
Well,
Hey,
Mark Twain said there are liars, damn liars,
hey, Mike.
statisticians.
Mike, we invited Anna to provide answers to our questions, not to have a debate. But I appreciate everybody. Okay, so Anna, I really want to sincerely thank you for coming and helping us understand the issue. And I know it sounds like this is going to be become an issue in the coming session. So this was super helpful to us, and I really appreciate your time and your insight and your research in helping us muddle our way through the issue. It's a very interesting topic.
And I'd like to add, Anna, that I appreciate the fact you're answering the questions and taking the questions. I just think we all have to hear both sides.
I completely agree with you, and that's what produces.
And I've heard yours.
That's what produces better ideas. So I appreciate you guys' questions a lot. It's given me a lot to think about too. And discussions like this is what ultimately will improve education. So I really appreciate you guys taking the time to talk to me today. Seriously. Thank you.
All right.
Great to meet all of you.
It was good to meet you.
Great night.
Yes.
Take care.
You too. Thanks, guys.
Yeah.
Bye.